The term Middle Ages was established during the 17th century and usually starts with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century. This is not what you are taught in Swedish history books, however, where the Middle Ages starts about 500 years later, around the year 1000, which is the time when the Viking way of living slowly died down, when the new Christian god slowly replaced the ancient Aesir and Vanir gods, and when the first written sources from Sweden exists, not counting pagan runes. The time around the turn of the century was also arguably the time when Scandinavia stopped being a world of its own and started being an integrated part of the rest of Europe. Of course, Europe wasn't foreign to Scandinavia in any way back then. Ever since the Great Migration period, a number of Scandinavian peoples has had contact with Europe, perhaps most notably the Goths, who traveled south from what today is southern Sweden and went on to establish the Ostrogothic and Visigothic kingdoms in southern Europe. Scandinavia was an inhospitable region with long winters and limited farmlands, and so when the population started to increase, rival earls and kings started to compete for power and, more importantly, food. This is one theory to how the Viking Age started. Hard places breed hard men, and so the Vikings started to raid other lands for riches and food. The Danes in the south followed their ancestors and went to England, where they raided the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as well as Francia. They went on to explore further south until they reached the Mediterranean. The Norwegians in the west, who were accustomed to the North Sea, went even further and discovered places such as Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Of course, there was no united Sweden back in the Viking Age, nor any Denmark or Norway. Instead, there were several minor chiefdoms, earldoms, and kingdoms without any formal structure or hierarchy. Usually the area around Mälaren or Lake Mälar, also known as the Mälaren Valley, is seen as the historical heartlands of Sweden. There lived the first Swedes, or the Svear, since the dawn of the Viking Age, in the land they called Svitjod. These people were known even by the Romans as the best shipbuilders in the world. In the late 8th century, the loose state fractured into a handful of more modern, more powerful, and more centralized Viking states. During the years that followed, they would launch Viking raids east, towards the Baltics and the rivers of the Rus, all the way down to Constantinople and Persia, growing stronger and richer, until one of them grew stronger and richer than the rest, and united all the Swedes in what we today call Uppland. Svea rike, they named it, which would in time turn into Sverige, the modern-day native name for Sweden. Yet the people of the Swedish realm didn't conquer much more than the people of Svitjod had. Instead, they warred across the Baltic Sea and protected their homeland by vassalizing and allying with their inland neighbors. It is evident that several other major centers of power existed to the south. The Goths that didn't travel south during the Great Migration period had founded several powerful kingdoms of their own. They were Värmland and Gotland, whom the Swedes had close ties to, and then there were Dal, Westrogothia and Ostrogothia, three independent and very powerful states. The people on Gotland, the Goths, had conquered the island from the early Smolandians after turning back north from Poland during the Great Migration period. This is why the modern-day region of Götaland and the island of Gotland has such similar names, despite their modern-day linguistic differences. The Goths don't really consider themselves cultural Goths or Swedes, but simply Goths instead. The Goths often fought the Swedes and themselves for power, but neither were unable to conquer the other. The Swedes had an advantage since they were all united under the Swedish realm, while the Goths were divided. Legends has it that the Gothic kings decided to join Sweden when they faced a Danish invasion from the south, but nobody knows for sure. Regardless of how it happened, with the Goths on their side, it didn't take long until all the states of eastern Scandinavia were united under this one realm. Westrogothia and Ostrogothia became fully integrated parts of Sweden, as integrated as a region could be under the early Scandinavian feudal system, while more distant states such as Blekingia and Greater Helsingia became vassals of the Swedes. After decades of Ostrogothic rule, the minor Smolandian states gladly united under Swedish rule and formed the modern-day province of Småland, or Smålandia. To the northwest, the Dalemen of Järnberga land came to adopt the Swedish culture, and in time, the modern-day province of Dalecarlia came to be viewed as the most iconic province for Swedish culture, with their midsummer, Dalecarlian horses and red cottages. The homeland of the Goths was called Götaland, or Gotland in English. To the north were Svealand, where the early Swedes lived. Beyond that were the wild Northlands, home of the Jemts, Helsingians and the Uralic Sami people. And across the Baltic lay the Eastern lands. These four regions would later be known as the Lands of Sweden. Of course, the Eastern lands were lost to Russia and became independent later on, but more on that later. With the unification of the Goths and the Swedes, the history of Sweden had begun, and Scandinavia was ready to join the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages.